Hi, this is your host. As you may know, people in the Middle Ages were not exactly known for their great table manners or their super healthy diet. And of course, there are many reasons why we do UN to want to be too much like our medieval ancestors when it comes to how they ate. But the truth is that medieval cooking techniques were actually pretty sophisticated, and medieval cuisine was not just meat, potatoes, and black pudding. In fact, medieval cooks used spices, herbs, and fruits in recipes centuries before they became popular in Europe. Medieval cooking was also quite diverse, depending on where you lived. The food available to nobility would be very different from what peasants ate. But both groups had their own version of a hearty, filling meal. When it came to eating, medieval people didn't use utensils like we do today. Instead, they used whatever they had handy, whether it be their hands, fingers, spoons, tankards, or even pieces of bread. Sometimes they ate off of plates, and sometimes they ate directly out of the pot. It all depended on the occasion and who was eating what. In general, though, most people preferred to eat with their hands, especially when it came to things like fruit or other desserts. Cooking in the Middle Ages was more than just a method of preparing food. It was an art form, and the cook was a vital member of the household. In noble families, the cook was often a highly paid employee, because preparing a feast for a large family and staff took a lot of work. Cooking was typically done over an open fire in a hearth or a range made of stone or brick. Ranges could be found in almost any home, but larger hearths might have been made of iron or stone and were elevated so that several pots could be hung over the fire at once. Wealthy households might have even hired servants whose sole job was to keep the fires going at all times. In a typical medieval kitchen, you'd find all sorts of tools hanging from the ceiling or propped up against the walls, in addition to the usual spatulas, ladles, and other implements. You might also see cleavers, knives, mortars, and pestles, and even some early versions of mechanical devices, such as a crank-operated egg beater. This technology was imported from the Middle East, and while it might look funny to us today, it was a marvel in medieval times. The kitchen was probably the busiest room in the house, and these gadgets helped make cooking easier and more efficient. Now let's talk about the food itself. When you think of medieval food, you might imagine lots of meat and little else. While it's true that meat was a staple of medieval cuisine, it wasn't necessarily the only thing on the menu. In fact, fish was also a common ingredient in medieval cooking, although it was usually reserved for special occasions. This was due to the fact that fish was more expensive to purchase and harder to keep fresh than meat. However, many European countries have long coastlines and rivers and lakes full of freshwater fish. These fish were caught and prepared in a variety of ways, including being baked, fried, boiled, and grilled. Fish was often served with bread, cheese, or fruit, and it was sometimes used as an ingredient in soups and stews. In addition to meat and fish, vegetables were also a part of the medieval diet. However, they were not as popular as they are today. Most people ate the vegetables that grew easily in their region, and they were often used in soups, stews, or as side dishes. Some of the most common vegetables included onions, carrots, cabbage, leeks, and peas. Fruit was also eaten during the Middle Ages, and it was often used in desserts. However, it was also used in savory dishes as well. In fact, many medieval recipes called for fruit to be used in place of modern ingredients like sugar. Apples, pears, plums, and cherries were all popular choices. Nuts were also a staple of the medieval diet, and they were often used in desserts or as a garnish. They were also a good source of protein and fat, which were important nutrients during a time when people were generally trying to gain weight. In addition to these foods, there were also some less conventional ingredients that were used during the Middle Ages. For example, people in the Middle Ages were big fans of blood sausage, which is made by cooking the blood of an animal with fat and spices, and then stuffing it into a casing. It might not sound appealing to us today, but it was a popular dish in many parts of Europe. Another popular dish was head cheese, which was made by boiling a pig's head until it was tender, then removing the skin and chopping up the meat. The mixture was then seasoned and pressed into a mold to form a loaf. As you can imagine, this dish did not resemble cheese at all, but it was called head cheese because it was similar in texture to a firm cheese. Finally, one of the most unusual ingredients used in medieval cuisine was mummies. That's right. People in the Middle Ages believed that mummies could be used as a treatment for various ailments, and they were often ground up and mixed with other ingredients to make a kind of medicine. However, there is no evidence that this practice was ever effective, and it eventually fell out of favor as attitudes towards death and the afterlife changed. So overall, medieval food was pretty diverse and interesting, although it might not be to everyone's taste. However, it's important to remember that not everyone ate the same things during the Middle Ages. The food available to nobility was very different from what peasants ate. For example, peasants typically ate whatever they could grow on their small farms, while the diets of nobility consisted of imported goods and delicacies that were reserved for special occasions. Of course, the quality of food also varied depending on where you lived. People who lived near the coast had access to fresh fish, while those who lived inland had to rely on dried or salted fish. Those who lived in warmer climates could grow a wider variety of fruits and vegetables than those who lived in colder climates. No matter where you lived, though, one thing was for sure. Life was never dull when it came to food. There was always something new and exciting to try, even if it wasn't always appetizing. That being said, there were some foods that were popular throughout all of Europe during the Middle Ages, regardless of climate or social class. One of these was bread, which was made from flour, water, and yeast. Bread was a staple of the medieval diet, and it was eaten at every meal. In fact, the price of bread was so important to the economy that the value of money was often measured in terms of how much bread it could buy. Another popular food was cheese, which was made from milk, cheese, and rennet. Cheese was often served with bread, and it was also used as an ingredient in many medieval recipes. Finally, there was beer, which was made from water, barley, and hops. Beer was enjoyed by people of all ages, and it was often served with meals. In fact, beer was so popular in the Middle Ages that there was even a saying, "A man is known by his beer." But it wasn't just the food that was interesting during the Middle Ages. The way that people ate was also quite different from the way we eat today. For example, medieval people often ate with their hands, even if they had utensils available to them. This was because it was considered more natural and it allowed them to socialize while they ate. In addition, medieval people often ate standing up rather than sitting down at a table. This was especially true of peasants, who often ate while they worked in the fields. Of course, there were also some major differences between the way men and women ate in the Middle Ages. Women were expected to eat less than men, and they were often given smaller portions of food. In addition, women were not allowed to eat certain foods, such as meat or eggs, during certain times of the month. Men, on the other hand, were expected to eat heartily, and they were often encouraged to consume large amounts of alcohol. The dining customs of the Middle Ages were also quite different from what we are used to today. For example, in medieval times, it was common for people to eat their meals at different times of the day. Breakfast might consist of something light, such as bread and cheese, while dinner might be eaten in the evening. In addition, medieval people often ate different foods at different times of the year. For example, during the winter months, they might eat more hearty foods, such as meat and potatoes, while during the summer months, they might eat lighter foods, such as fruit and vegetables. In conclusion, the food and eating habits of the Middle Ages were quite different from what we are used to today. However, they were also quite diverse and interesting. From the more common ingredients such as bread, cheese, and beer to the more exotic ingredients such as nuts and spices, there was always something new and exciting to try in medieval cuisine. In addition, the way that people ate in the Middle Ages was also quite different from the way we eat today. Medieval people often ate with their hands rather than using utensils, and they often ate standing up rather than sitting down at a table. However, despite the differences, there were also some similarities between medieval food and eating habits and what we are used to today. For example, medieval people also enjoyed simple pleasures such as bread, cheese, and beer, and they also had their own versions of soups and stews. Overall, the food and eating habits of the Middle Ages were definitely a product of their time. However, they were also quite interesting and diverse, and there is no doubt that medieval people would have had a lot to say about the way we eat today.